The year is 256 BC. In the preceding 8 years of warfare, the Roman Republic had successfully pushed Carthaginian forces out of much of their former territory in Sicily. After initially responding to the call of the city of Messana for aid against the forces of the major Greek city of Syracuse in 264 BC, Rome soon became embroiled in a much wider conflict with the North African power for control of the island. Within a year, they had converted Syracuse and its ruler Hero from a foe into an ally, and in 262 BC, they would face the Carthaginians in the first major battle between the two powers outside of the city of Agrigentum. Following a brief flirtation with disaster, the Romans scored a decisive victory, seizing the city and robbing Carthage of its major centre in the south of the island. In the years after their triumph, though, the land war became bogged down. The Carthaginians remained secure in their major western centres of Drepana, Lilybaeum and Panormus, and the only major land conflict of this time, the Battle of Thermae in 259 BC, resulted in the defeat of a small Roman force. In the aftermath, the Roman situation in the north threatened to come undone, but by 258 BC, the Romans had recovered their position and succeeded in capturing a number of smaller Carthaginian centres. But throughout these years of stalemate, a war on a vastly greater scale was being fought on the sea. As the paramount naval power of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage enjoyed a major advantage over Rome on the waves, and it soon became clear that to stand a chance of victory in Sicily, the Romans would have to build a fleet of their own. On the surface, it might have seemed like the inexperienced Roman sailors would have stood little chance against their seasoned opponents. Instead, however, the Romans embarked on an improbable run of victories at sea. Between 260 to 258 BC, they managed to eke out victories over Carthaginian fleets at Mylae, Sulci, and off the Cape of Tyndaris, thanks to an ingenious new weapon known as the corvus that neutralized their opponents' greater maneuverability. These victories allowed them to contemplate a major escalation in both the land and sea war, that if executed properly, had the potential to knock Carthage out of the war entirely. An invasion of Africa. After assembling a vast fleet and army, in 256 BC, the Romans would meet the Carthaginians once again off the coast of southern Sicily in the Battle of Ecnomus. If we believe the Greek historian Polybius, then here nearly 700 ships carrying over 300,000 men would clash, potentially making it the largest naval battle in world history. When the waves settled, the result was the same as their prior engagements. After nearly 100 of their ships were sunk or captured, the defeated Carthaginian fleet withdrew, leaving the way to Africa open. For the first time, Rome would take the fight to Carthage in its deepest heartlands. From here, the victorious Romans didn't stop to rest on their laurels. After pausing briefly to regroup their forces, they proceeded to the Greek city of Selinus in southwestern Sicily. Now unopposed by the Carthaginians, the Roman fleet made the hazardous crossing to Africa, landing successfully at Cape Bon. Advancing rapidly from their landing point, the commanding consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso marched their forces to the nearby city of Aspis. After a brief siege, the unprepared garrison surrendered, and the Romans plundered the city and enslaved much of its population. This victory put them within only 40 miles of the city of Carthage itself, and at this point, their opponents' prospects looked dim. The end of the campaigning season was fast approaching though, and rather than marching on their enemy's capital, the two consuls remained in Aspis and sent back word to Rome for further instructions. In response, the Senate ordered them to split their forces. According to Polybius and Cassius Dio, by the way of the later author Zanarus, Regulus was ordered to stay put in Africa with 15,000 men and 500 cavalry to overwinter. Meanwhile, Vulso returned to Rome with the fleet to receive a naval triumph for the victory at Ecnomus. In response to the invasion, the Carthaginians recalled their general Hamilcar from Sicily with 5,000 men and 500 cavalry to join their forces in Africa. Here he took up command alongside Hasdrubal, the son of the Hanno who had been defeated at Agrigentum and Ecnomus, and another general named Bostar. With this combined force assembled, it set out to meet the Roman threat. Meanwhile, Regulus was also on the move. Instead of staying put as ordered, he pillaged several other settlements in his path, then marched westward and besieged the town of Addis. It was here that the Carthaginian force caught up with him. Perhaps wary of the strength of the Roman infantry in open battles, the Carthaginian commanders chose to avoid an immediate assault on the besieging army, instead constructing a fortified camp on a nearby hill. According to Polybius, this decision quickly proved fatal, as it neutralized any advantage that the Carthaginian cavalry and elephants might have possessed. Regulus was quick to capitalize. The Romans attacked the camp at dawn, and although their initial assault was repulsed, the pursuing Carthaginians were surrounded by reinforcements and massacred. Exactly how many died is uncertain. The only figures we have come from the much later authors Orosius and Eutropius, who give likely inflated numbers of 17 and 18,000 killed, along with 5,000 captured. With Addis taken, the Roman army then quickly advanced on Tunis, which quickly fell. After a spectacular campaign, with his army only miles from Carthage itself, Regulus now seemed on the verge of ending the war in the most decisive manner possible. The atmosphere of the city as the Roman army approached appears to have been one of near panic. At this time, Carthage was already swollen with refugees due to ongoing conflicts with the neighbouring Numidian kingdoms, and with the approach of the Roman army, famine quickly set in. It is at this point that peace overtures were apparently made between the two sides, though our sources disagree on who took the initiative in proposing terms. Polybius, generally considered the most reliable source for the war, claimed that the initiative came from the Roman commander himself, whilst every other major source is united in stating that these talks were initiated by the Carthaginians in the hopes of avoiding destruction. Which is correct is anyone's guess, but there are good reasons to think that either side would have welcomed a negotiated peace. While such a desire on the behalf of the Carthaginians is obvious, it may also have been in Regulus's interest to make peace. His term as consul was now almost up, and he could well have wished to end the war before a replacement could arrive and claim the final glory. Strangely enough, a small number of these authors, including Frontius, Valerius Maximus, and an excerpt of Livy, claim that at this point the Senate actually increased the term of Regulus's command against his will, though the idea that he would oppose such a measure at this point seems bizarre. His force was also likely less than that required to successfully conduct a long-term siege of a port city the size of Carthage, although this may have changed if the Romans were able to provide reinforcements and naval support. In the end, though, these talks came to nothing, as the Roman commander's proposed terms were too harsh. According to Cassius Dio, the Carthaginians would be required to quit Sicily and Sardinia for good, to pay restitution for all of Rome's war costs, along with an annual tribute, and to release all Roman prisoners immediately whilst ransoming their own. Further terms would see the Carthaginian fleet reduced to only one warship, with the city itself being left as all but another Roman ally. Unsurprisingly, the terms were refused. Carthage's situation was not, however, hopeless. In the previous years of the war, they had sent a number of recruiting officers to Greece to seek aid, and around this time, one returned with a large number of troops, along with a Spartan officer named Xanthippus. Concluding that their previous commanders had been inadequate to the task of defeating the Romans, the Carthaginian authorities instead chose to place this man in charge of their forces, though their generals retained overall command. Xanthippus soon convinced the Carthaginians that their possession of elephants and superior cavalry would serve them well in a battle on level ground, which they had specifically avoided at Addis. Xanthippus might well have experienced Pyrrhus's use of war elephants against the Spartans 2 decades earlier, and was thus able to advise the Carthaginians on their proper use. After spending the remainder of the year being drilled by Xanthippus outside the city, the Carthaginian forces were revitalized. When the campaigning resumed in spring of 255 BC, Polybius claims that they consisted of some 12,000 infantry, supported by 4,000 cavalry and nearly 100 elephants. On the Roman side were Regulus's existing forces of roughly 15,000 men and 500 cavalry, their numbers perhaps swollen by whatever men he had managed to recruit in Africa, and minus any casualties they had sustained at Addis. The two sides would clash in the Battle of Tunis, a conflict that threatened to end the war in Rome's favour. Acting this time under Xanthippus's instructions, the Carthaginians deployed their elephants in more standard fashion than they had at Agrigentum, placing them in a line in front of their citizen troops, while situating their mercenaries and cavalry on both flanks. In response, the Romans deployed their infantry in a deeper formation of maniples than normal, an act likely intended to slow the elephants' advance. Whilst the Roman infantry did hold firm initially and succeeded in pushing back the Carthaginian right flank, it was the superior Punic cavalry that eventually swung the day. After driving off the outnumbered Roman horsemen, they turned and flanked the enemy infantry. The few Roman troops that had succeeded in fighting their way past the elephants were soon dispatched by the Carthaginian phalanx. The majority of the Roman forces still held firm, only to be trampled by the elephants and cut down by the missiles of the Carthaginian cavalry. In the end, only the 2,000 who had routed the Punic right flank succeeded in fleeing back to Aspis. Another 500 were captured, along with Regulus himself. With the Carthaginian victory, the invasion of Africa was over. The Romans had been humiliated. According to a legend recited to us by Polybius, the defeated Regulus would later be returned to Rome on a peace mission, under the promise that he would return to be executed unless he secured an agreement. After failing to do so, he held firm to his word and returned to Carthage, where he was duly tortured to death. The more likely explanation accepted by scholars, however, is that he simply died in captivity. With their surviving forces now besieged in Aspis, the Romans dispatched their now vast fleet on a rescue mission. Led by the new consuls for 255 BC, Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Paetinus, the fleet seems to have followed the same route as during the invasion. After a minor diversion to the island of Corcyra, the fleet proceeded to Africa, inflicting another heavy defeat on a Carthaginian fleet on the way at the Battle of Cape Hermaeum. With their numbers now swelled by the ships seized from their enemies, the Roman fleet successfully evacuated what remained of their invasion force. Yet it was the return journey that truly spelled disaster for the Romans. According to Polybius, as the fleet returned to Sicily, the consuls ignored the advice of their more experienced captains and chose to cruise along the southern shoreline. This area was well known for dangerous weather at that time of year, and as the fleet neared Camarina, they were soon caught in a storm. With no safe harbour to flee to, the Roman ships were defenceless. Of the 364 vessels that had set out from Africa, only 80 would survive the trip back to Syracuse. The rest were lost with their crews, which may have totaled over 100,000 men. This number of deaths was simply cataclysmic. By comparison, the worst Roman defeat of the Second Punic War, the Battle of Cannae, would see less than half this number of casualties. But despite the terrible scale of these losses, the Senate doesn't seem to have held either consul responsible. Instead, Polybius tells us that both were rewarded with triumphs upon returning to Rome. Some modern scholars have also expressed doubts as to Polybius' claim that the consuls ignored their captain's advice, noting that with the west of the island still held by the Carthaginians, a southerly route was the only one practical. As for the huge loss of manpower and ships, the Romans would regroup with their characteristic haste. According to Polybius, the Romans immediately rebuilt their fleet, and he would claim that only 3 months later, Rome could boast 220 ships at their command. Meanwhile in Sicily, Carthage was on the offensive. With Xanthropus most likely having returned to Greece, in 254 BC a new general named Carthallo would lead Carthaginian forces to recapture Agrigentum, whilst elsewhere Punic forces retook the important island of Corcyra. Lacking the manpower to hold Agrigentum, the Carthaginians followed a similar approach to that the Romans had when they took the city and simply burnt it to the ground, although the city would later recover. In response, Rome would once again dispatch both consuls to Sicily to retrieve the situation. Unusually, both men were repeat office holders and already had military experience to draw upon, though not all of it good. Alongside Aulus Aetilius Caetinus, who had received a triumph in 258 BC for his actions in the Sicilian land war, the other consul for 254 BC was none other than Gaius Cornelius Scipio. As we detailed in our last episode, in 260 BC, Scipio had blundered into an ambush whilst attempting to seize the important island port of Lipara just north of Sicily. Caught under the cover of nightfall, he and his small fleet were captured, for which he acquired the derisive nickname Ascina, or the She-Donkey. After being ransomed sometime after his capture, his political career revived, and in his second term he would prove far more competent. Arriving in Messana with the new Roman fleet, the two consuls joined up with the survivors from the storm at Camarina. With Corcyra lost and Agrigentum destroyed, the Roman forces set out to seize Carthage's remaining ports in the northwest of the island. Receding along the coast, this new force lay siege to the Carthaginian ports of Panormus, Drepana and Kephalodion, whilst a number of cities willingly came over to the Roman side. Drepana would eventually be rescued by Carthallo's forces, but the Romans succeeded in taking the other two cities, reducing Carthage's grip on the island even further. The Roman campaign of 254 BC had achieved its goal, and for his successors, Scipio Asina was vindicated with a triumph. With Carthage's major ports in Sicily either blockaded or in Roman hands, in 253 BC a potential route to Africa was open once more. Whilst no invasion on the scale of 256 BC was contemplated, that year the consuls Gnaeus Servilius Capio and C. Sempronius Blasus were able to raid the coast of Tripolitania, east of Carthage. At Meninx, however, the Romans' luck ran out. Here the fleet became caught on the shoals, forcing their crews to lighten their vessels to refloat them. After returning to Sicily, the fleet sailed to Panormus, where they made yet another mistake. Instead of taking the coastal route to Messana, the fleet apparently struck out across the open sea towards Italy. Then, as the fleet neared the Cape of Palinurus, disaster struck again. To quote Diodorus of Sicily, "Having set sail thence for Rome, they were overtaken by a storm, and again suffered shipwreck, and lost 150 warships, and all their transports and treasure besides." Once again, the Roman navy had been defeated by the weather. The loss of another Roman fleet, along with the tens of thousands of men they carried, was a huge setback. According to Polybius, this disaster so soured the Romans to naval combat that the Senate resolved to win the war on land instead. Modern scholars, though, deem this statement to have been something of an exaggeration. Whilst the Romans do indeed seem to have focused on land-based operations for at least the next 2 years, there was no great change in their strategy in Sicily, which focused on continuing to besiege the remaining Punic strongholds in the west of the island. The result was slow but steady progress. In 252 BC, the port of Thermae Himerei fell to the Romans, as did Lipara shortly after. Consul Gaius Aurelius Cota received a triumph for these conquests, but in truth, these achievements were poor given the size of the two armies required. In response, the Carthaginians dispatched a large force to the island, led by Hasdrubal, one of the generals who had fought against Regulus in North Africa. For much of 252 and 251 BC, the Romans would refuse to make open battle with this army, with Polybius claiming that this was due to their fear of the Carthaginian elephants, which had proven so effective in Africa. However, in either late 251 BC or possibly mid-250 BC, this would all change. Hearing that one of the two Roman armies had returned to Italy, Hasdrubal seized the opportunity to go on the offensive. His army, which was accompanied by some 140 war elephants, proceeded eastwards from Lilybaeum towards Panormus, where the remaining Roman army was quartered. The Roman commander, proconsul Lucius Caecilius Metellus, refused to be drawn into a conflict though, remaining behind the city's fortifications in the hopes that the Carthaginians could be lured into a trap. Hasdrubal was only too happy to oblige. The result was the Battle of Panormus, the last major land battle of the First Punic War. The Roman chances in this battle were aided by a set of careful preparations by Caecilius. Instead of arraying his army in front of the city to meet the Punic forces, he kept the bulk of his troops within Panormus. After stockpiling missiles by the city wall, he sent his skirmishers to hamper the enemy's movement, with orders to focus on the Carthaginian elephants. The Romans were further aided by the geography of the area outside Panormus, which required their opponents to cross a river whilst approaching the city. Marshalling their troops on the city side of the river, the Carthaginians were forced to immediately deploy into battle formation. Faced without serious opposition, Hasdrubal allowed his forces to be drawn in towards the thin Roman lines. Then the Carthaginian elephant drivers, fresh from their dominating performance in Africa, made a mistake. To quote Polybius, "At this point the elephant drivers, who were competing with one another to win praise from Hasdrubal and wanted to be the agents of victory, made a concerted charge towards the first line of Roman defenders, who put up no resistance. With their lines no match for the assault, the Roman skirmishers fell back to a trench that the Romans had dug outside the city walls. Pursuing their fleeing enemies, the Carthaginian elephants came under fire from the city as well. Panicked by the missiles, many of the creatures stampeded, disrupting their own battle lines in the process. Meanwhile, the rest of the Carthaginian force advanced on the still weak Roman centre, which Caecilius had continued to reinforce with a steady supply of skirmishers. At this point, the Roman general sprung his trap. sending his heavy infantry through a side gate into the left flank of the enemy army. The dual shock of the elephant stampede and the Roman flanking maneuver was too much. Soon the Carthaginian advance turned into a rout. If we believe later sources, then anywhere between 20 to 30,000 of its men were massacred, a total considered dubious by modern historians, whilst anywhere between 60 to all 140 of its elephants were captured. In a now familiar pattern, the victorious Caecilius received a triumph, at which he exhibited the captive elephants. Hasdrubal fled back to Carthage, where for his failure, a death sentence awaited him. The Battle of Panormus would prove to be Carthage's last great opportunity in the land war. Whilst until now the Romans had only been able to harry the edges of Carthage's remaining territory, the next year would see them strike deep into the western reaches of Sicily. In addition to their land victory, 250 BC saw the building of another 50 ships, bringing the combined Roman fleet back to 200 vessels. Led by two experienced former consuls, Gaius Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, the Romans marched on Lilybaeum, the capture of which would almost certainly end the war in Sicily. After first forcing the Carthaginians from Selinus, who chose to destroy the city rather than allowing it to fall to their enemies, they besieged the main Carthaginian centre on land and blockaded it from the sea. This blockade, however, soon proved to be ineffective. Despite threats by the Carthaginian mercenary forces to mutiny, the city was successfully resupplied when a Carthaginian fleet steamed into the bay with impunity. Led by another man named Hannibal, this time the son of the Hamilcar who had previously commanded Carthaginian forces in Sicily and Africa, the fleet provided much-needed supplies to the defenders, along with another 10,000 mercenaries. After resupplying the city, the fleet then succeeded in slipping out of its port under cover of nightfall. From there it proceeded to Drepana and joined up with another new Carthaginian commander, a man by the name of Adherbal. Further difficulty was caused when the defenders successfully set fire to the Roman siege works, forcing them to abandon any idea of a direct assault. Finally, a number of blockade runners would keep the city well supplied for a time, whilst also supplying Carthage with information on conditions in the base. Polybius even points to the actions of one of these blockade runners in particular, a man he refers to as Hannibal the Rhodian. Quote, "An eminent Carthaginian called Hannibal the Rhodian offered to sail into Lilybaeum, see for himself what the situation was, and bring back a full and detailed report. They welcomed his offer, but doubted that he could see it through, since the Roman fleet was anchored at the mouth of the harbour. Nevertheless, he fitted out his own ship, sailed over to one of the islands off Lilybaeum, and at the 4th hour of the next day found a favourable wind and sailed into the harbour in full sight of the enemy, who were dumbfounded by his daring. Not only did he get out with his ship and crew unscathed, leaving the enemy ship standing, so to speak, but he also stopped after sailing on a little way and spread his oars, as if to challenge the enemy. But the speed of his oarsmen deterred anyone from coming out against him, and so he made his way home, having proved himself with a single ship more than a match for the whole enemy fleet. And later on, he often performed the identical feat, supplying the Carthaginians with vital information about what was needed, and at the same time boosting morale in the beleaguered city and dismaying the Romans by his daring. Eventually, however, the Rhodian's luck ran out, and the Romans were able to catch his ship by surprise using a type of vessel known as a quadrireme that they had captured from the Carthaginians. Unable to escape, the Rhodian attempted to turn and fight, only for his vessel to be boarded and overwhelmed. 249 BC saw the Romans attempt to go on the offensive once more. After likely mustering fresh ships, they were able to assemble a fleet of roughly 240 vessels at Lilybaeum, which they resupplied with rowers sent overland from Messana, likely to avoid Adherbal's fleet at Drepana. This fleet was then split roughly evenly between the new consuls for that year, Lucius Lunus Pullus and Publius Claudius Pulcher. According to Polybius and other ancient authors, Pulcher was already unpopular by the time he took command, being characterized variously as a snob, a drunkard, and even mentally unstable. Whether this is true is uncertain. According to J.F. Lazenby, the Romans are known to have often blamed defeat on the personal failings of their commanders, and it may be that this reputation is an exaggerated one. Either way, Pulcher's name would soon become a byword for poor leadership. Resolving to take the Carthaginian fleet at Drepana by surprise, he took 123 ships and set off during the night, arriving at its harbour around dawn. In a famous story recited by ancient authors such as Cicero, Livy, and Suetonius, but that goes unmentioned by Polybius, the Roman general is then reported to have been displeased as he took the augurs prior to battle, when the sacred chickens refused to eat, heralding misfortune. Throwing the chickens into the sea, he declared that if they would not eat, then perhaps they might drink instead. According to Polybius, Attobal was initially surprised by the arrival of the Roman fleet, but he quickly rallied his forces. Exactly how many ships he had at his disposal is uncertain, but modern estimates place the Carthaginian forces at between 100 to 130 vessels. Deciding to fight rather than endure a blockade, Attobal sallied forth from the harbour with his fleet. By fortune, he did so just as the Roman fleet attempted to enter, throwing his enemies into chaos. As the Romans attempted to pull out of the harbour, Attobal's fleet turned and attacked from the open sea, pinning their enemies against the shore. Interestingly, in the battle that followed, none of the Roman vessels are described as carrying corvae. One reason suggested for this is that the added weight of the corvae would have made the Roman ships less maneuverable, though it has also been noted that the device would have been easy to disassemble if needed. Alternatively, the use of this device may have been by now considered so routine that no special mention of it was felt necessary by ancient authors. Whatever the case, the Romans would not get a chance to employ any of their prior tactics. With the shoreline at their back, their vessels were easy targets for the Carthaginian rams. Before the battle was over, 93 of the Roman ships had been sunk, and Pulcher himself would escape with only 30 vessels under his command. With that, the Carthaginians had won the most stunning naval victory of the entire war. Shortly afterwards, the situation was further compounded by the loss of the remaining Roman fleet under his fellow consul Lucius Lunius Pullus. After sailing first to Messana, this fleet then headed south to Syracuse, where it collected fresh supplies for the besiegers at Lilybaeum. With the northern route to the city blocked by Attobal's fleet, Pullus proceeded along the southern coast. After a possible engagement with another Carthaginian fleet commanded by Carfallo, Pullus and his forces found themselves caught in another storm off Camarina. Whilst the Carthaginians managed to escape by rounding Cape Pachinon, the destruction of the Roman fleet was total. Out of 120 ships, we are told that 105 were lost, taking with them tens of thousands of men, along with any hope of resupplying the Roman army at Lilybaeum. The destruction of both fleets and the resulting loss of manpower and ships seems to have sparked a short-term leadership crisis in Rome itself. So inept was Pulcher's leadership judged at Drepana that soon afterwards he was placed on trial for treason by the Roman tribunes. In the meantime, Rome's other consul Pullus attempted to make up for the disaster on land, launching a surprise attack on the town of Eryx, which lay between Drepana and Lilybaeum. Though the consul was successful in seizing the town, it was not enough to reverse his loss of the fleet at Camarina. According to Cicero, Pullus was arraigned on charges himself shortly after, though he would commit suicide before he could be tried. Pulcher himself would narrowly avoid the death penalty, possibly on a technicality after a storm interrupted proceedings. Instead, he was made to pay a massive fine, and was ordered by the Senate to nominate a dictator. Whilst up until this point, the duties of this irregular office could often be quite trivial, such as presiding at important religious rites, on this occasion, this figure was to be charged with absolute power in order to save the Roman war effort. Pulcher, however, chose to mock the Senate's order. According to a later epitome of Livy, as well as the Fasti Capitolini, a list of Roman chief magistrates, he appointed a low-born man named Marcus Claudius Glycia. Based on his name, Glycia may well have been a former slave, and at the time of his appointment was employed as a scribe. This frankly farcical turn of events came to an end when the new dictator was unable to appoint a deputy, or master of horse, and he was forced to resign. Finally, to solve the crisis, the former two-time consul Aulus Atilius Caetinus was appointed dictator, with the victor at Panormus L. Caecilius Metellus as his deputy. And far from suing for peace, as many powers would have done in the face of such catastrophic losses, the Romans followed the same ruthless approach as they had in their war against Pyrrhus 3 decades before. They simply absorbed the losses and continued the war. In the aftermath, Atilius and Metellus would take command in Sicily, continuing the relentless Roman stratagem of besieging Lilybaeum and attempting to take Drepana. Whilst the two achieved little of note, their efforts do seem to have stabilised the Roman war effort, giving their forces vital time to regroup. In this, they were also aided by the Carthaginians' complete failure to follow up on the successes of 249 BC. As discussed by J.F. Lazenby, Carthage could have used this opportunity to send troops to relieve the siege of Lilybaeum, to try and recapture Panormus, or even to put pressure on Rome's vital ally of Syracuse. However, no such forces were sent, and despite being left with no effective Roman fleet to oppose it, Carthage instead seems to have reduced the size of its naval forces in the years after the Battle of Drepana. Eventually, much of its fleet seems to have been returned to Africa, and the victorious general at Drepana, Adherbal, largely disappears from accounts of the war after this point. About the most significant action is that according to Cassius Dio by way of Xenarus, the Punic general Carthallo would make his own raid on Italy around this time, though this seems to have accomplished little other than seizing plunder for the strained Carthaginian treasury. This paradoxical lack of aggression by Carthage may be explained by ongoing problems on the fringes of its North African heartlands, where they had likely remained in conflict with some of their Numidian and Libyan vassals after Regulus's failed invasion of 256 BC. During this time, they may also have committed large amounts of resources to taking the city of Hekatompelos in what is now modern Algeria, which could have hindered further action elsewhere. Alternatively, it is possible that influential Carthaginian factions may have felt that the war with Rome was already beginning to wind down, and as a result they opposed any major commitment of resources to breaking the deadlock in Sicily. Whatever the cause for the lack of Carthaginian aggression, the result was that they passed on their last major opportunity to turn the war in their favour. In the years immediately after 249 BC, the land war in Sicily would drag on inconclusively. According to Polybius, the defeats of that year had again soured the Romans to waging war at sea, and they were either unwilling or unable to finance a new fleet. Instead, they seem to have continued their strategy of besieging the remaining Punic strongholds in western Sicily. In 247 BC, however, the situation briefly threatened to come unstuck. That year, the Carthaginians would replace Carthallo with a new commander who would attempt to revive their fortunes. The arrival of Hamilcar Barca in Sicily was marked by a brief flurry of activity from the Carthaginian forces. After executing an abortive attack on the Roman army besieging Drepana, he turned his attention instead to raiding softer targets. After launching a series of raids on southern Italy, he established himself at a fortified site near Panormus, from where he was able to disrupt Roman supply lines and tie up troops needed elsewhere. In 244 BC, he made his boldest move. Attacking Mount Eryx under the cover of nightfall, he succeeded in massacring the local population. The Roman garrison on the summit seems to have survived, however, and as Professor Richard Miles notes, the Carthaginians were left halfway up the mountain, where they settled for harrying the Roman besiegers at Drepana. These daring moves would win Hamilcar great prestige back home, and Polybius would go on to describe him as the most able of Carthage's generals in the First Punic War. Bold as his actions were, however, they did little to improve Carthage's strategic position. It is important to recognise that his options in Sicily were limited from the day of his arrival. The Carthaginian treasury was now all but empty, as shown by the heavily debased coinage that they issued during the final years of the war. In addition to meaning that no new mercenaries could be hired to reinforce Sicily, they also seemed to have struggled to pay their existing troops. Shortly before Hamilcar's arrival on the island, the mercenaries under Carthallo's command had mutinied, and Hamilcar may have resorted to his raids simply to acquire the treasure necessary to keep his own troops in line. Ultimately, as historian Dexter Hoyos notes in a chapter of A Companion to the Punic Wars, Hamilcar's goal in Sicily was not to win the war, but simply to avoid losing it. And soon after, even this possibility was taken out of his hands. By the end of 244 BC, the military situation was back in much the same deadlock as it had been on Hamilcar's arrival, with the Romans in control of most of Sicily, but the Carthaginians holding on in Drepana and Lilybaeum. Whilst Hamilcar's forces had little room to maneuver, without adequate naval support, the Roman sieges were also failing to produce results. In addition to this, Rome may also have been on the verge of exhaustion. Alongside the financial troubles associated with the building and loss of multiple fleets, the manpower of the Roman state would have fallen drastically. Whilst its census records prior to 225 BC are noted by many historians to be of dubious reliability, the records for 246 BC list approximately 242,000 adult male citizens, a reduction of more than 50,000 from the start of the war. Moreover, this number does not include any losses by non-citizens, or by Rome's allies, which may well have been higher. But even in the face of these pressures, the Romans stubbornly continued the war of attrition. And eventually, they made the only choice they could if they wished to break the deadlock. In 243 BC, Rome would build one last fleet. The fleet the Romans raised in the final years of the First Punic War was one that they could not afford. With the state treasury unable to finance it, it had to be built using private subscriptions. To quote Polybius, "Nevertheless, thanks to the patriotism and generosity of the leading citizens, enough was raised to see it through. 1 or 2 or 3 men, depending on their means, undertook to build and fit out a quinquereme, on the understanding that they would recover their expenses if things turned out well. Eventually, enough funds were gathered to construct 200 quinqueremes, which according to Polybius were based on the superior design of the ship captured from Hannibal the Rhodian at Lilybaeum. This fleet was placed under the command of the new consul, Gaius Lutatius Catulus, whilst his colleague Aulus Postumius Albinus remained in Rome due to religious duties. Setting out for Sicily, Polybius tells us that the Romans had a stroke of good luck, arriving there whilst the entire Carthaginian fleet was still in Africa. Finding his forces unopposed, he captured the harbour at Drepana and put renewed pressure on Lilybaeum. With the Carthaginian fleet expected in due time, he then focused on improving his own forces, drilling his troops in naval manoeuvres. Whilst the Roman crews were busy gathering valuable experience, Carthage scrambled to re-equip their mothballed fleet. Mustering 250 ships, they set sail under the command of a man named Hanno, perhaps the same who had previously met defeat at both Agrigentum and on the sea at Ecnomus, though this is far from certain. Unlike the Romans, whose main priority was to force a major naval engagement, the primary aim of the Punic fleet was to resupply Hamilcar's troops in Eryx, as well as their surviving bases at Drepana and Lilybaeum. As a result, their vessels would have been weighed down by supplies, and carried comparatively few marines. Going by the figures provided by Polybius, even these vessels may have been severely undermanned, with just 10,000 men being assigned to crew 70 of these ships, a total that's far less than the usual 300 needed to crew a quinquereme. Proceeding to the Aegates, a group of islands off the northwestern coast of Sicily, here they waited for a favourable wind that would carry them to Eryx before the Romans were alerted. Unfortunately for them, however, Catulus soon heard of the Punic fleet's position. Crossing to another part of the Aegates, he waited for the Punic fleet to set sail. On the 10th of March 241 BC, the outcome of the First Punic War would be decided. That day, the favourable wind the Carthaginians had been waiting for finally arrived, and the fleet set sail. Due to their relative positioning, these winds proved far less favourable for the Romans, and Catulus faced a difficult choice. On one hand, he could pursue the Carthaginians despite the adverse conditions, or he could risk delay and wait for the winds to improve. The Roman commander chose the first option and gave chase. Despite the adverse wind, his experienced crews performed well, and soon they intercepted the enemy fleet in the open sea. From here, the Carthaginians stood little chance. Weighed down by supplies, their vessels were far less manoeuvrable than those of their opponents, who Polybius claimed deliberately stripped anything of excess weight from their vessels. In addition to possibly being undermanned, many of their crews had also been hurriedly recruited and would have lacked experience compared to the well-drilled Roman forces. With these advantages on their side, prior Roman strategies such as the use of the corvus seemed to have been unnecessary. The result of the clash was some 50 Punic vessels sunk by the Roman rams, along with another 70 captured with their crews. Hanno fled back to Carthage with the remainder of his fleet, where he too would be executed. The destruction of the Punic fleet at the Battle of the Aegates spelled the end of the war. Exactly why the Carthaginians collapsed so quickly in its aftermath is uncertain. The most commonly cited reason, and the one given by Polybius, is that the Punic government was either unable or unwilling to pay for the construction of another fleet to resupply its Sicilian forces. Whilst the Romans had resorted to private contributions when the state proved unable to finance a new fleet, no such initiative was forthcoming from the Punic aristocracy. Unable to rebuild its navy, and with its Sicilian forces isolated, Carthage may simply have bowed to the inevitable. Alongside this, the failure of such a major naval effort may have dealt something of a psychological blow to the Carthaginians, which led them to hastily abandon the war. Whichever is true, in the aftermath, Carthage's leaders granted Hamilcar full power to do whatever was necessary to end the war. Left with no alternative, the general chose to sue for peace. Taking care to avoid damaging his personal prestige, he delegated the responsibility for peace talks to a subordinate named Gesgo, commander of the Carthaginian forces in Lilybaeum. Negotiating on Rome's behalf was Catulus, who offered terms that, whilst harsh, were more generous than those presented to Carthage by Regulus during his African invasion. The Carthaginians were ordered to vacate Sicily, along with all the islands between it and mainland Italy, though they retained control of Sardinia for the time being. In addition, they were ordered to hand over all Roman prisoners, and to pay a hefty ransom for their own. As a final insult, the Carthaginians were to pay a huge indemnity of 2,200 talents over the next 10 years, equivalent to nearly 56 tons of silver. Later, after Rome initially rejected the treaty its general had negotiated, this total was increased to 3,200 talents, to be paid over 5 years, perhaps in order to reimburse the Roman citizens for financing the fleet. At the same time, both sides pledged to remain out of the affairs of each other's allies. Carthage had no choice but to accept. After 24 years, the First Punic War was finally over. Rome had secured Sicily at the cost of the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. You might think that the end of this relentless conflict would have given both sides a moment of respite. Certainly the Carthaginians would have appreciated an end to hostilities, which would have allowed them to turn their attention to consolidating their remaining territories and rebuilding their wealth. Whilst it had come away as the clear loser, at the end of the war, Carthage was well placed to regain its former position. According to J.F. Lazenby, the peace treaty they signed was not a crippling one. They might have lost their possessions in Sicily, along with their place as the foremost naval power in the western Mediterranean, but the Romans had not interfered with Carthage's North African empire, nor with its ability to seek fresh conquests elsewhere. Indeed, whilst the First Punic War had been reaching its conclusion, a Carthaginian general by the name of Hanno the Great had been successfully expanding its direct territory in northern Africa. Interestingly, he also appears to have extorted large amounts of taxes from Carthage's Libyan subjects to aid the war in Sicily, though little of it ever seems to have reached Hamilcar Barca's forces. At the same time, Rome was faced with the task of consolidating its new conquests in Sicily, which would go on to form its first overseas province, and eventually require it to adjust its system of government. In reality though, neither side would enjoy any great break from warfare. Over the next 2 decades, Rome would be at war again with its old enemies in Cisalpine Gaul, then later across the Adriatic in Illyria. By the end of these conflicts, its territory had expanded well into northern Italy, and its conquest on the shores of the Balkans had brought it onto the periphery of the Hellenic world. In Africa, the Carthaginian situation quickly went from bad to worse, and they found themselves facing an existential threat of their own making. We discussed before that in the final years of the war, Carthage was struggling to pay its mercenary forces in Sicily, some of whom responded by mutinying. After the withdrawal of Hamilcar Barca, its still 20,000 strong forces had been left at Lilybaeum under the command of Gesgo. Rather than providing these troops back pay upon their return to Africa, however, the Carthaginian government attempted to make them accept a smaller settlement, citing the costs of the treaty with Rome. After a series of failed negotiations led by Hanno the Great, the mercenary army rose against their masters, sparking a rebellion that was soon to be joined by many of Carthage's Libyan and Numidian subjects. The resulting war would last for over 3 years, and was marked by extreme brutality on both sides. After an initially poor performance, Carthage eventually rallied, and by 237 BC it had defeated the mercenary armies and subdued its rebellious vassals. Where this conflict becomes more relevant for us, however, is how Rome chose to exploit the situation. According to Adrian Goldsworthy, writing in The Fall of Carthage, in the years after making peace, the Romans scrupulously followed the terms of the treaty, refusing to interfere with its former enemies' rebelling vassals. Somewhere between 240 and 239 BC, the Punic mercenaries in Sardinia revolted, and soon after they sent emissaries to Rome requesting their protection. Unlike at Messana, however, according to Polybius, the Romans refused this request on multiple occasions. Around 237 BC, the native Sardinians then rose up and expelled the mercenaries for their excesses, which included a systematic extermination of Carthaginians on the island. Afterwards, the mercenaries found sanctuary in Rome, at which point the Romans pulled a dramatic about-face. To quote Polybius, "At much the same time, at the invitation of the mercenaries who had gone over to their side after leaving Sardinia, the Romans launched an expedition to the island. The Carthaginians protested that they had a prior claim to Sardinia and began to prepare for a punitive campaign against the rebels on the island, but the Romans seized the opportunity to vote for war against Carthage, claiming that it was they rather than the Sardinians who the Carthaginians were preparing to attack. Even at the time, the Roman actions in this case appear to have been considered unjust. As noted by Polybius, this seizure was contrary to all justice, and is largely condemned by ancient writers as a purely cynical act. Carthage, however, was in no position to wage a further war with Rome. In addition to abandoning Sardinia, it was also forced to hand over a further payment of 1,200 talents, completing its humiliation. We will examine the exact chain of events that led to the outbreak of the Second Punic War at the beginning of our next episode. It seems likely, though, that the seizure of Sardinia in such a fashion contributed to the long-term bitterness felt by Carthage against the Romans, and indeed Polybius would cite it as one of the major reasons for the eventual resumption of hostilities. However, at this junction, it should be stressed that another major war between Rome and Carthage was by no means inevitable. Whilst the seizure of Sardinia generated renewed bitterness between the two powers, we are told elsewhere that relations between the two had warmed after Carthage willingly returned Roman merchants who had been imprisoned for trading with the Libyan rebels. As the mercenary war continued, Rome would eventually release its remaining Carthaginian prisoners without ransom, further improving relations. In time, even the newfound bitterness after the Sardinian affair may well have dissipated. As the two no longer shared a direct border, Carthage could well have chosen to focus on its African territories, whilst Rome may have remained occupied with its newfound affairs in Greece and northern Italy. As with the First War, however, it was not to be. In the decades ahead, both powers would instead pursue expansionist policies in Western Europe that would soon spiral into renewed warfare. Before we end today's video, let us briefly examine the post-war actions of one man in particular that helped lead to the resumption of wider hostilities. If there was any man who could be said to have come out of the Carthaginian side of the war as a victor, it was Hamilcar Barca. After Carthage's capitulation in 241 BC, Hamilcar had resigned his command, possibly because he believed the decision to sue for peace had been premature, or that the Carthaginian government was attempting to scapegoat him for the defeat. Around 239 BC, however, after the failures of Hanno the Great's leadership in the opening years of the Mercenary War, he found himself recalled and placed in joint command of Carthage's forces. Eventually, he managed to replace his rival with a more agreeable general, and after a campaign that saw atrocities and betrayals on both sides, he successfully put down the rebel armies. In the aftermath, he forged an alliance with his future son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, and was appointed to lead an army to Spain, seemingly to consolidate Punic territory on the southern coast, but likely also with expansion in mind. Exactly how he came by this appointment is unknown. Dexter Hoyos argues that at this point Hamilcar's faction had become ascendant over other political groups in Carthage, and that in the years ahead, Carthage's generals came to dominate its affairs. By comparison, Adrian Goldsworthy argues that given the limited sources we have available on Carthage's governance at the time, it is possible to interpret this appointment in several different ways. This includes a power grab by Hamilcar and the popular faction at Carthage, or simply that his perceived competence led to him being placed in charge of a campaign that was approved of by Carthage's elites. Either way, prior to his departure for Spain, Polybius provides us with a curious anecdote as to Hamilcar's actions. In the years since the end of the First Punic War, he tells us that Hamilcar maintained an implacable hatred towards Rome, one that he attempted to pass on to his 9-year-old son. After performing a likely customary sacrifice to the Carthaginian god Baal Shamim, Hamilcar asked all of us present to step back. Left alone with his son, he asked the boy whether he wished to join him in Iberia. After his son gladly accepted, he led him to the altar, and having the boy place his hand on the sacrificial victim, made him swear unremitting hatred to the Romans. Whether any of this anecdote is true is uncertain. Polybius himself was dubious of its veracity, and it may well be entirely invented. Whatever the case, Hamilcar did not survive to see the war with Rome renewed. After several successful years in Spain, during which time he carved out a new empire largely controlled by his family, he was slain in battle against an unknown Iberian tribe somewhere around 229 BC. 8 years later, his son, now 26 years old, would succeed his father at the head of Carthage's armies, where he remained throughout the entirety of the Second Punic War. The name of that son was Hannibal Barca. one of the most famous generals in ancient history. And from 218 BC, war on a titanic scale would scar the Western Mediterranean once again. Hey folks, it's Charles here. Thanks for watching the whole video through. This particular video has been a long time coming, so I'm glad to finally get the ball rolling on finishing some of the older series on this channel. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and consider helping support the channel over on Patreon. That's all from me, thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.